Perfect. Then I think we can start on time. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the second day of the conference with the theme of experimental approaches. I'm glad to be chairing the panel of Neurolinguistics and introduce our respected speakers. Before introducing the keynote speaker, as in the other panels, I'll briefly review what the domain of neurolinguistics is all about. As I've been informed, there is a considerable share of the audience who would like to just start their journey to explore language and the brain. According to Liz Menn, in a press article on Linguistic Society of America website, neurolinguistics is the study of how language is represented in the brain. In fact, neurolinguists try to answer questions like this. What makes human language possible in our brains? Why is our communication system so elaborate and so different from that of the other animals? Does language use the same kind of neural computation as other cognitive systems like music or mathematics? Where in your brain is a word that you've just learned, and how does a word come to your mind when you need it, and why does it sometimes not come to you? When there are two or more languages involved, some other interesting questions arise, like if you know two languages, how do you switch between the two? And how do you keep them from interfering with each other? If you learn two languages from birth, how is your brain different from the brain of someone who speaks only one language, and why? Do people who read languages from left to right, like English, have language in a different place from people who read languages written from right to left, put in simple words? If you're dyslexic, in what other way is your brain different from the brain of someone who has no trouble reading? And so many other interesting questions, for example, when it comes to language disorders. As you can see, neurolinguistics is deeply entwined with psycholinguistics, which is the study of language processing steps that are required for speaking and understanding words, sentences, etc. The use of neurotechnology, be it neurophysiological methods like EEG, TMS, or hemodynamic methods like fMRI, and lots of other neurotechnological advancements, play a major role in making experimentation possible in neurolinguistics. Such fancy techniques have been so interesting for the researchers that sometimes caused an issue, that the research is done more technique-driven than question-driven. So instead of asking what can I add to the existing literature and what specific problem at any scale can I solve with my experiment, they start with what can I do with this and that. This is indeed a serious harm, in my opinion, that beside other issues like shallow statistical analysis methods, has only added to the replication crisis we are facing in psychology and similar sciences. So we cannot reproduce the results as there hasn't been fundamental effort in a good experimental question and paradigm than using some fancy high-tech methodologies. However, there has also been some solid and quality experimental research which can serve as the strong backbone and skeleton of neurolinguistic literature. Some important questions have been answered by outstanding researchers, like the keynote speaker of this panel, whom I'm delighted to introduce, even though I believe she doesn't really need an introduction for many of you in the audience. For every researcher who has been somehow involved in electrical neuroimaging of language, Cara Federmeier's name sounds familiar, and her contributions, especially in exploring and defining semantic components of language and time domain, either from the time she was trained in Marta Kutas's lab in San Diego or afterwards in Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, have been frequently cited. Prof. Cara D. Federmeier is a full professor in the Department of Psychology and a full-time faculty member at Beckman Institute for Technology. She's the director of the Cognition and Brain Lab and the co-director of the Illinois Language and Literacy Initiative. Her research involves language processing, hemispheric differences, semantic memory in normal and aging population, and she extensively uses electrophysiological methods in her research. Before we proceed to the keynote talk, just a quick note that for the purpose of time management, I'll be reminding time to the speakers of this panel 5 minutes before the end of their presentation, except for the poster presentation, which will be 1 minute before the end. So I do apologize in advance for the interruption. So Cara, I would like to thank you again for accepting my invitation and being with us here today. We are all ears. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for having me. And I'm really just delighted to be able to share some of my research with you today. So what fascinates me as a researcher is that as human beings, we kind of live in a world that's infused with meaning, right? So our everyday experience involves interacting with a wide variety of what are really complex perceptual stimuli. We look at objects, we see faces, we hear spoken words, we encounter written words. And these stimuli are all very complex. They're often ambiguous, may have multiple interpretations, and yet we respond to them by immediately and effortlessly, seemingly, bringing to mind a really rich and multimodal array of knowledge. And that's what we experience as the meaning of these perceptual events. And so at the broadest level, my research is trying to understand the cognitive and neural mechanisms that allow us to have this rapid and ever-present meaning apprehension from the world. And words provide a particularly striking example of this process. And one reason that it's really amazing we can process words the way we do is because, of course, their physical properties don't relate directly to the information that they call to mind. They're symbols. And second, because words typically occur as part of a very rapid information stream. They come in at a rate of about 2 to 4 per second. So it's very impressive that we can so readily make sense of this input. And yet, of course, the magic of language is that through words, we can come to know the thoughts and feelings and perspectives of others across impressive reaches of space and time. This thing that I showed you at the beginning, this person is Oscar Wilde. And in 1885, he wrote, "But strange that I was not told that the brain can hold in a tiny ivory cell God's heaven and hell." So how is it that we can use language to traverse time and space and do so readily? Well, studying how people comprehend language is actually pretty difficult because comprehension is, of course, inherently an internal state. In cartoons, we might put a light bulb over someone's head to indicate that they've comprehended something because comprehension doesn't have a characteristic behavioral manifestation. There's not something that always happens that we can perceive when someone comprehends. And moreover, comprehension is dynamic. It develops and changes rapidly, and it has to match that rapid nature of the input. And so what this means is that we need to find a way to measure what people are comprehending without perturbing that too much. As Winnie the Pooh expressed by A.A. Milne, when you're a bear of very little brain and you think of things, you find sometimes that a thing which seemed very thingish inside you is quite different when it gets out in the open and has other people looking at it. Now, although comprehension of meaning is studied at many levels and using many types of methods and analyses, a particularly useful method is one that can directly measure brain states and that has a very fine-grained temporal resolution. And we do this using electrophysiological measures. And these methods take advantage of the fact that the brain signals that underlie cognition are electrical in nature, and that we can pick up those electrical signals even outside of the body. And so what we do is place electrodes, which are just discs of metal that are conductive on participants' heads, and these passively pick up the electrical potentials that are created by brain activity. We amplify and record these signals to give us the resulting electroencephalogram, or EEG. And at the same time, we can ask people to listen, read, or look at things much as they normally would, just simply to comprehend them. And we can then extract the EEG signal following the presentation of, for example, some particular word of interest. And by averaging together the EEG for those words, we can discern regularities in the brain's response and create what is known as an event-related brain potential, or ERP. And I'll be showing these, and just to orient you, on the y-axis, I'm going to be showing voltage. And by convention in my part of the field, we plot negative voltage up. So negative going responses go up. And time will be on the x-axis, and I'll usually be showing you about 1 second worth of time following the presentation of, say, a word. And we obtain one of these waveforms for every sensor on the head. So ERPs have been studied in the context of cognition for about 50 years now, and so we know a lot about what different aspects of this signal might mean in terms of cognition and, in some cases, the brain. And today, I'm going to focus on a part of the signal that's related to the processing of meaning. And that part of the signal is a negative going peak in the waveform that we see right before 400 milliseconds in young adults. And this, because of it's a negative going potential and it peaks around 400, we call it the N400. And the N400 is part of the normal response to meaningful stimuli of all types, including written and spoken words, as well as signed words, but also to pictures, to faces, to environmental sounds like the sound of a cat, to gestures, and so forth. It's seen between about 250 and 550 milliseconds after the onset of any of these meaningful stimuli, and the size, its amplitude, is reduced by factors that make meaning processing easier. So compare on this slide words that fit, indicated by green arrows, and words that don't fit, indicated with red arrows, the context they happen to be in. And I'm showing that here for written words and spoken words and line drawings. And what you can see is that the overall shape of the ERP response is different to these different kinds of stimuli. They are all processed in different ways by the brain. But what you can see is that in all cases, and with very similar timing, having a supportive context reduces the N400 response to all of these types of stimuli. So the N400 is a highly reliable and fairly specific measure of the processing of meaning. And what I mean by that is this is when incoming perceptual information is being linked to our store of memories and knowledge. And so this then provides us with a really powerful measure of the early stages of how the brain can figure out the meaning of a word. And so let me tell you a little bit about the picture that we've gotten from studying the N400. So first, let's consider the traditional view of comprehension. In the traditional view, understanding a word would happen through a set of stages. You decode the visual word's form, you would recognize that this form is a string we know, and based on that recognition of knowing that you know a word, you would look up information about that word, its meaning, its part of speech, and so on in our mental dictionaries. So this is how most theories, at some level, most theories of word processing, and indeed theories of object processing and face processing look like. And the question is this true? And luckily, the N400 provides us with a measure of what seems to be the closest thing we might find in the brain to that semantic access. And when we study this process with the N400, a couple of things really stand out. Now, first, we know from our own experience, as well as from research, that words are differentially easy to recognize. The word cat in English is quite easy. It's familiar. We've accessed its meaning many times. The word catharsis is harder. This is a word that's going to be less familiar to many people, and we're probably more uncertain of its meaning. And catavid isn't a word in English at all. So, on the traditional view, we should expect that the brain activity associated with meaning access, and I told you that's the N400, would happen later for catharsis than it would for cat, and that maybe it wouldn't happen at all for catavid. But that's not what we see. The N400 is not later to words that would be harder to recognize. In fact, a fascinating feature of the N400 is that its timing, its latency, is incredibly stable. Essentially, the N400 timing only changes with age. It slows down by about 1 to 2 milliseconds per year across the adult lifespan. But the size of the N400 changes, But what that size is sensitive to is also very revealing. What the N400 cares a lot about is not so much the properties of the individual word, but how confusable that word is with other words. So what I'm showing you here is the N400 response to a metric that is known as orthographic neighborhood size. And this is basically a measure of how many other words in a language are similar to the word you're looking at. In English, we might calculate this by asking, how many words can I make if I simply substitute out one letter of the word I'm looking at? So a word like cat has a large neighborhood. It's similar to many other words in English like bat and cot and car. In contrast, another perfectly good English word like ski is much less similar to other English words. And what you can see here is that the N400 is notably larger for words that are more confusable with other words. Now, what's even more striking is that this same pattern holds if we look at non-words. So lar is not a word in English, but it is similar to many English words. And NLR is not a word in English at all. And what I've plotted here in blue are the N400 responses to lexical items, to items that have a stored meaning, words or acronyms, and in purple to non-lexical items, so pseudo words or non-words, things that don't have a learned meaning. I'm keeping negative up, so higher on the graph is bigger N400. You can see that overall shape, so that N400s are bigger for items that have a higher orthographic neighborhood size. But note that we get exactly the same pattern. There's no main effect for being a word versus being a non-lexical item. So even non-words elicit activity in our meaning processing system, and the size of that response depends on or cot or car. And importantly, what this data shows us is that the brain doesn't wait until it's sure of exactly which word is coming in. What it does instead is send this incomplete, noisy information forward to semantics. And so when we look up the meaning of cat, we're actually also getting some of the meaning information associated with other similar words. And that's true even when the thing we are perceiving at the time doesn't turn out to be a word at all. So, what studies of the N400 have revealed is that the brain doesn't wait to recognize a word or other stimulus before processing its meaning. It goes directly from perception to meaning access. And so, correspondingly, our initial apprehension of the meaning of an input is multifaceted and it's messy. It's still a work in progress, so to speak. As Theodore Dreiser noted, words are but the vague shadows of the volumes we mean. Little audible links they are, chaining together great inaudible feelings and purposes. And indeed, of course, most of the time, we're not processing just a single word, but we're using a stream of words to build up a message over time. And we have also used the N400 to understand that process of incremental comprehension across, say, a sentence. Because an N400 response is elicited by every word we encounter, we can examine what happens to the N400 as a sentence unfolds. And what you can see here is that, so imagine someone's reading a sentence like, she kept checking the oven because the cake was taking an awfully long time to bake. And I'm simply plotting the N400s as we move through the sentence and the colors are changing from blue to red. And what you can see here is that the first few words of a sentence elicit a large N400 response as lots of new meaning information becomes active. And as the sentence unfolds, if it's building up a coherent message, semantic processing becomes easier and easier. So that by the end of a sentence like this, the meaning of a word like bake is very easy to process because a lot of the features we would normally want to access for bake, a lot of the work we would normally do to understand bake has already been done as we moved through the sentence. Now, of course, language contexts differ in how much support they provide. Sugar is easier to process in a sentence like, I like coffee with cream and sugar, where it's very predictable, compared to, she didn't think she had any sugar. We didn't really know what to expect there. And correspondingly, the word sugar has a smaller N400 in that more constraining context. And of course, some words fit a given context better and correspondingly will elicit a smaller N400. Here I'm also using an example to remind us that context can be more than just a sentence. So what I'm showing you here is the response to the word slow in the sentence, Jane told her brother that he was exceptionally slow. But now that sentence itself might have been preceded by something like, Larry spent more than an hour in the bathroom, he lingered over his cereal and nearly missed the bus, where his being slow is a congruent ending to the subsequent sentence. Or, Larry spent less than 10 minutes in the bathroom. He wolfed down his cereal and was first on the bus, and in that case, the word slow in the same following sentence will elicit a larger N400. So meaning processing is highly dependent on a word's fit to the larger language context. And I've always loved this exchange from Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, said Humpty Dumpty, which is to be master, that's all. And of course, context isn't just about language. In this example, people are hearing sentences, and the only difference is that those sentences are being spoken by different kinds of voices. The black line is an adult's voice, and the red dashed line is a child's voice saying, every evening I drink some wine before I go to sleep. And we can see that elicits a larger N400 spoken in a child's voice than in an adult's voice. And what this shows us is that our meaning processing is affected also by the larger, more general context, not just the language context, but the context of who's speaking. What do I know about them? What are they likely to say? What things have we just... And there's internal states matter as well, our own and our expectations. And indeed, a primary focus of my work for a while now has been in demonstrating that people are often generating fairly specific expectations as they comprehend, and in trying to figure out what those expectations are like and how they affect what we understand and what we remember. So consider a context like they wanted to make the hotel look more like a tropical resort. So along the driveway, they planted rows of... Most people expect the sentence to end with the word palms, and correspondingly, palms should elicit a relatively small N400, and it does. That's the solid line here. People do not tend to think that either the word pines or the word tulips is a very good ending for this sentence, so those words should have larger N400s, and they do. But we designed this experiment so that one of the words, here pines, is more related to, it has more meaning features in common with the expected word. So pines is not a good fit to this particular sentence, but like palms, pines are evergreen trees. And we reasoned that if comprehenders actually predicted the word palms and got ready for it, meaning got all of its features active, then having features like evergreen and tree active should also make it easier to process pines compared to tulips, even though it doesn't fit the sentence. And that's exactly what we see, facilitated N400s to words that are related to what might have been predicted. So language comprehension is affected by the knowledge and expectations that people bring to bear. And what that tells us is that processing is flowing in both directions, top down from people's expectations, as well as feed forward. So people's knowledge will obviously affect their comprehension. And we also have to remember that all of this is unfolding, often very rapidly, in time. And as I've showed you, some processes, like the N400, seem to have a very fixed timing. So the speed with which information becomes available to people also matters. And these factors will, of course, differ across people and across groups of people, for example, as a function of age. We know that as people age, they get better at some things. For example, the older we get, the more words we know, the more knowledge we have, and we also know more about how words and things in the world go together. At the same time, however, we are also slowing down. Those are the red lines. We have a harder time holding on to information in working memory and recalling information from long-term memory. So, older adults have more knowledge with which to make predictions, but they may not be able to always get those predictions ready in time. So we looked at that prediction probing design again. Here, this is now young adults listening to sentences rather than reading them. And I'm showing this to you because it's a nice opportunity to show again that these effects are quite reproducible and we see them across different modalities. Again, ERPs look different to speech than to reading, but you can see that same clear N400 effect. And you can see again that it's graded so that we have that reduced response to pines compared to tulips. So we have that prediction-related facilitation. Now let's look at what healthy older adults between the ages of 55 and 80 do when they're listening to the same sentences. And the pattern is different. Older adults continue to show smaller responses, smaller N400s to words that fit the context. They show that facilitation for palms compared to pines and tulips. But differently from the young adults, as a group, they don't show the facilitation for the related unexpected item. In other words, they're comprehending just fine, but they don't seem to be predicting. And on the right, I'm showing you the older adults' responses from reading so that you can again see these are very reproducible across modality. And in both cases, older adults as a group do not seem to be making specific predictions to the same degree as young adults. Thinking about language and aging, James Thurber said, with 60 staring me in the face, I've developed inflammation of the sentence structure and a definite hardening of the paragraphs. But I want to emphasize that this actually isn't a case of aging making comprehension in some way worse. It's making comprehension different. It's making comprehension less driven by expectation, and this will have both negative and positive consequences. And what we find actually is that there are different modes of comprehension that anyone can be in. Comprehension can be more or less driven by our expectations and predictions. So the processes that we use to derive meaning from text can differ across people as a function of age and language proficiency, but can also vary within people across circumstances. And in other lines of work, we've shown that young adults can switch between more and less predictive modes of comprehension, and that depends in part on their task goals and the kind of material we've asked them to read. And it's useful for them to be able to do that, for all of us to be able to do that, because there are indeed advantages and disadvantages to each comprehension strategy. What we find is that prediction can help comprehenders use context effectively. It can ease word processing, particularly in noisy or complicated environments. And it's a good way to learn because if you make a prediction and your prediction is violated, you now have that mismatch to signal that something can be learned. But prediction also demands attention. And we are often going to be wrong in our prediction, which means that it requires us to have ready processes that are required to handle mispredictions. And in a very recent line of work, we've been showing that another downside of prediction is that it can skew our memory for what we experienced. For example, in recent work done in my lab by my postdoc Ryan Hubbard, we had people read sentences like, "Be careful because the top of the stove is very," and people think this sentence will end with the word hot. Instead, however, we gave them the word dirty, which is a sensible but unpredictable completion of this sentence. And we then tested people's memory for what they read. And what we found is that they were very likely to misremember seeing the predicted word hot. That's the blue bar here, what we're calling the lure. So if you compare that with the red bar of other words that they had not seen, you can see that they're endorsing those lures more commonly. So people can erroneously remember seeing or hearing what they expected, and that's true even though we clearly showed them that it was a different word that ended the sentence, and so they should have known their predictions were wrong and updated. So given that prediction has positive and negative consequences for processing, you might think, well, the best option would be to be able to do both. And our work suggests that actually this is exactly what the brain does, in part by taking advantage of the fact that we have two cerebral hemispheres. So a very brief primer, the brain has two halves, and these two halves are very similar in their overall anatomy and physiology, but they nonetheless function differently. And we all know probably that the left hemisphere is very important for language production. And we know this in part from studies of language disorders such as aphasia, which create problems with people expressing themselves. But comprehension is actually more complicated and harder to study. And it isn't so clear that the left hemisphere is dominant for comprehension. One of the most dramatic ways to study comprehension by the two hemispheres of the brain is using patients that are sometimes known as split brain patients. And these are patients that have had their corpus callosum, which is the bundle of fibers connecting the hemispheres and allowing them to communicate. They've had this fiber bundle cut to control epilepsy. And the result is that for these patients, the two halves of the brain are operating essentially independently. And so these kinds of experiments were done beginning in the 1960s by Roger Sperry. Now, each half of the brain gets sensory information from one half of the body in the world, and each half of the brain controls the muscles on one half of the body, in both cases, the opposite half. So the left side of the brain controls the right hand, for example. Now, for vision, it isn't that each half of the brain sees out of one eye, but rather that each half of the brain gets information about the opposite half of the visual array. So if someone is fixating centrally, everything on the right side of space goes to the left hemisphere. And what this means is that you can show a split brain patient two pictures or two words, one on each side of the screen, and those pictures will go to the opposite hemisphere. And then you can then ask that person to report what they're seeing using their two hands. Just as an aside, if you ask them to speak, they can only talk about what the left hemisphere perceives, because in most people, only the left hemisphere can talk. But again, they can communicate their understanding by picking up, say, matching pictures with their hands. So here, for example, a patient is shown a snow scene on the left, which is going to the right hemisphere, and a chicken foot on the right, which is going to the left hemisphere. And each of the patient's hands correctly picks out a picture corresponding to what that hemisphere, the hemisphere that controls that hand, what it saw. And what these studies have shown is that both hemispheres can comprehend the world and can comprehend language, but they do so somewhat differently. Now, even when the hemispheres are connected, they do operate somewhat independently, which just makes sense. If you give one hemisphere an advantage in terms of time and access to the information, that hemisphere will tend to be the one that processes that information to a greater degree. So we can use the same method that was used with the split brain patients, which is known as visual half-field presentation, to get a sense of what each hemisphere is doing, even in a non-patient population. So, for example, we can ask people to read the sentences I've already talked about, and we now present that critical final word in either the right or the left part of visual space. And what I'm showing you here is that when we do this, and this is again just with college students, we get a very interesting pattern. The left hemisphere, the one associated with language production, is the one that shows that prediction-based similarity effect. So it shows that facilitation for pines. In contrast, with presentation bias to the right hemisphere, N400 amplitudes just pattern with the fit of the item to the context. So facilitation for palms, note the right hemisphere can comprehend these sentences just fine. In fact, its facilitation for the most expected word is identical to the left hemispheres. But the critical difference here is that it does not show that prediction-based facilitation for pines. And in fact, it's showing the pattern that I already showed you that we see in general for older adults. So it seems that pre-activation of a word that's likely to come up next is something that seems to arise from left hemisphere processing mechanisms. And it may be because we're making those predictions by modeling what we would be likely to produce in those sentences. All right, but now let's consider another kind of unexpected word. Let's say we read a sentence like, "A huge blizzard swept through town last night. My kids ended up getting the day off from school. They spent the whole day outside building a big..." People think this sentence will end with the word snowman. The word towel obviously doesn't make a lot of sense in this sentence, but now we have a different kind of related anomaly, jacket. What's different about this is that before, the word that was unexpected was related to the word that you might have expected. But here, the word jacket is not at all related to the word snowman. They don't share any features in common. Instead, the word jacket is related to the overall event. If you're outside playing in the snow, you may be wearing a jacket. So jacket is not a word that should appear in this part of the sequence, but it is a word that might be associated with the larger meaning that you're comprehending. And what you can see is that in this case, the left hemisphere shows no facilitation for this related word. Instead, it's the right hemisphere that is maintaining activation for concepts and words that don't fit this part of the language sequence, but that are related to the overall event. So when we consider these two patterns side by side, I think this really shows us nicely how the brain uses multiple strategies in parallel to approach the task of comprehending. Both of our cerebral hemispheres are building a meaning representation, even from language. Both hemispheres are doing a good job. They know what words are a good fit and what words aren't, but they're prioritizing different things. The left hemisphere is prioritizing the sequence. The right hemisphere is prioritizing the larger event structure. And so these comprehension networks are going to differ in how they activate information over time and across a context. And so they deal differently with both expected and unexpected incoming information, and they're going to make different kinds of errors. And as we've been showing with our memory studies, they'll retain different aspects of what they have experienced. So the brain deals with the speed and complexity of language input by using context and, when it can, predicting, generating information about likely upcoming words, and preparing ahead of time at multiple levels to process those words. As this couple is saying, our lives are so predictable. I knew you were going to say that. This predictive strategy seems to arise from left hemisphere processing mechanisms, possibly because language comprehension is integrated with language production. And of course, the left hemisphere is quite important for that. So the left hemisphere is good at doing things like using context to shape word processing, at pre-activating likely next words and concepts, and sequencing, and at selecting the meaning of ambiguous words, like the word duck, which in English has a different meaning when used as a noun versus a verb. The right hemisphere instead seems to use a more passive approach, activating knowledge of events and using language to create vivid mental images. And in part because the right hemisphere isn't predicting, the right hemisphere also remembers information about the words and concepts that were encountered better in some ways, more veridically. It isn't going to be fooled into remembering what might have only been predicted. So together then, our comprehension system manages to be both efficient and flexible. And as we've seen, it can stay effective even when cognition changes. We know that changes in the availability of cognitive and neural resources with normal aging make predictive processing less likely. And yet we also have seen that older adults continue to comprehend well. So what I've shown you across this talk is that meaning feels effortless and immediate and unified. But what we see when we look under the hood, so to speak, is that it's very multifaceted and it's constructed over time. And meaning begins with the linking, and I think using time as a binding glue, between perceptual information, words, pictures, faces, and associated experience and knowledge stored across a very wide set of brain areas. Which information becomes part of that link depends on context, it depends on expectations and experience, on mood, on individual and group differences, and it differs even within a single person across the two cerebral hemispheres. So it's likely, therefore, that every instance of meaning access for a word is actually somewhat unique. But on the other hand, despite this incredible flexibility with which we use and comprehend language, there's also impressive structure and stability as well. We can see these reproducible patterns of brain activity during meaning processing across languages, individuals, over time, for different sets of materials, across culture and gender, and so forth. So I think the shared structure of the brain, shaped by shared human experience, means that people can enter into very similar states as they comprehend language.
Cara,
And so
apologies for interruption. I would like to just remind you that you have 2-3 minutes to go for the.
Okay, this is my last slide. So.
Okay, perfect.
So in the end, we're coming full circle back to Oscar Wilde, who wrote, "I said in Dorian Gray that the great sins of the world take place in the brain. But it's in the brain that everything takes place. It's the brain that the poppy is red, the apple is odorous, that the skylark sings." And he's right. Everything takes place in the brain, and that's what makes the brain such a fascinating object to study. But at the same time, we also shouldn't forget that our brain's ability to tap into Oscar Wilde's thoughts is made possible through language. And so I will end there and take questions in the remaining time. I want to thank my funding sources and my spatially and temporally distributed lab group, who really were critical for this work. And thank you for your attention.
So thanks a lot for the fantastic and enlightening presentation, Cara. I'm sure everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. So thank you, Cara, for being with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.